As the story goes, in 1928, a farmer in western Syria accidentally uncovered a necropolis buried beneath his field. It would soon be discovered that this was part of the expansive city of Ugarit, which had been abandoned around 3,200 years ago. Later excavations would uncover an extensive library, which presented archaeologists with examples of the gradual move away from cuneiform to a writing system similar to Phoenician. More importantly, this trove of literary text gave us our first insider view of Canaanite religion and the rich mythology that once dominated the land, which would later become known as Israel. The portrayal of gods like Dagon and Baal were drastically different from those found in biblical text written by their theological rivals, and a clear picture of their pantheon was formed. We learned about El's wives, Yahweh's origins, and the carnal yearnings of the gods. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. The Song of Songs, also called Song of Solomon and Canticle of Canticles, is a collection of perhaps 10 poems assembled into a single book that was later divided into 8 chapters. As this book is a collection of seemingly erotic poetry, its place in the Bible alongside text written by individuals with severe sexual hang-ups has prompted widespread speculation as to how, exactly, it came to be included in the canon. Each group who reads this text comes away with a different view, often as a way of explaining its inclusion within the Bible. If you're a Jew, you may see this book as an allegory for Yahweh's love for the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. If you're a Christian, then perhaps this is a love poem from Jesus to his church. These two explanations may seem a bit odd when considered in light of the wording of the text. The characters in the Song of Songs aren't always expressing the kind of love appropriate for such allegories. While these characters do care about one another, their well-being and prosperity isn't the subject of these poems. The love they wish to express is more physical in nature and has nothing at all to do with God's relationship to a nation or Jesus' feelings for a congregation. If you're an atheist, on the other hand, you'll probably read this poem and giggle at the sexual poetry that's been discovered in a religious text. The not-so-subtle innuendos coupled with erotic imagery that, to the modern reader, almost reads like insults, can be difficult to take seriously. Like when the man looks at his lover's smile and is amazed that she has all of her teeth, or when it's said she has hair like a flock of sheep. If you're unfamiliar with this text, I read it as a joke for episode 69 in February of last year for Valentine's Day. If you're listening to my show on your favorite podcast app, I'd suggest hopping over to YouTube to watch episode 69. For that special piece, I recorded a full video, complete with suggestive imagery at all the appropriate moments and inappropriate background music. While that episode was fun to record and edit, we're not viewing this work as a comical bit of sexy poetry. Nor are we pretending this is a piece about a deity's relationship with anyone. The poem, despite its place in a religious text, is secular in nature. It doesn't speak of prayer, worship, temple sacrifice, the nation of Israel, the chosen people, Yahweh's relationship with those people, congregations, the divine council, angelic messengers, or any sort of divine covenant. How this book may be used today isn't of concern to us. Our only concern is what this book was and where it came from. It's a serious book, one that deserves our attention and sincerity as we examine it. So we'll shelve our jokes and see this book the way it was meant to be seen. But before we get started, we need to cover a few details. First, let's discuss authorship. The opening line of the book reads, "The Song of Songs," which is Solomon's. This title is appended to the text. As with other writings in the Bible, as well as apocryphal books, we shouldn't take this to mean that Solomon authored this book. His involvement seems to be derived from his mention in chapter 3, verse 7, though we should point out that he's a character in the poem, not its author. Also, as we'll see, Solomon isn't actually a character in the story. The woman isn't speaking literally. She's comparing her lover to a king and their romance to the fine trappings of royalty. If we were to assume that Solomon was the author, or was literally present in the poem, then the work takes on an entirely different meaning. In it, Solomon is attempting to use his wealth and power to seduce a Shunammite woman, presumably the girl Abishag, who slept with David to keep him warm in his final years, in 1 Kings chapters 1 through 4. While I find this explanation interesting, especially as it could reference an older version of the David and Solomon story, in which Solomon is a tyrant king like Saul and David a mere shepherd, I don't think the evidence holds up. Personally, I'm compelled to see the mentions of Solomon as a means of comparison. The woman is speaking of her shepherd lover as if he were a king, so the most famous king with the greatest wealth is imagined. Next up is the date of composition. Conservative scholars wish to place this writing as early as possible for theological purposes, but rarely do their arguments hold up. While the legends of David and Solomon may have been inspired by historical figures who existed prior to the Assyrian and Babylonian conquest, their legendary status as rulers of a unified Jewish state are likely a product of post-exilic embellishment. Still, these poems could have been written, in whole or in part, prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and were then compiled and edited in the post-exilic period. The name of the resplendent king would have then been changed to Solomon to utilize the more familiar imagery, and we'd end up with the book we have today. However, the presence of post-exilic vocabulary in this book argues strongly against it being a First Temple composition. The poem is meant to be recited by three figures: a man, a woman, and a chorus of women. We know little of the two lovers, as I suspect they aren't supposed to be actual people, but stand-ins for any young couple. The man is a shepherd who tends his flocks in the nearby countryside. The woman lives in her mother's house where she wishes to bring her lover for private encounters. Finally, there's the chorus of women called the Daughters of Jerusalem. The original text didn't split the lines up by speaker, but most modern Bibles are courteous enough to do so for us. When reading the Song of Songs, you'll notice the speaker being announced by the text: man, woman, and daughters. Think of these like lines in a script with the character name at the beginning of each section of dialogue. The daughters often interpret the action for the audience, but they might also represent worshippers, though not of Yahweh. Ezekiel 8:14 complains of worship of Ishtar and Tammuz in Jerusalem, where groups of women would weep for the deceased god before he was rescued from the underworld by Ishtar. Of course, all references to Ishtar and Tammuz would necessarily be expunged before the poem could be accepted by a monotheistic Jewish audience, though we could expect remnants of its origins to be left behind. Searching for their lost god and failing to find him can be seen in Song of Songs 3:1-3. Tammuz, the lover of Ishtar, vanishing from the earth and descending into the underworld, is reflected in Song of Songs 6:1-2, and their love overcoming death and rescuing Tammuz from the underworld is found in Song of Songs 8:6-7. A fourth character appears in the songs, the city guards or the sentinels, who are mentioned in 3:3 and 5:7. The woman goes searching for her lover in the city, but is found by the guards who beat her and end her search. These guards represent the restrictions of social conventions that prohibit the unwed lovers from expressing their emotions openly. Instead, they must move about and meet in secret to avoid notice. The prophets in the Old Testament condemned sex magic rituals performed in Israel and Judah, and the Song of Songs may have once been part of the liturgy of just such a ritual or rituals. The Shulamite woman of Song of Songs might have originally been Shalmith or Shahar, the dawn goddess once worshipped in Jerusalem, which would also explain the female worshippers known as the Daughters of Jerusalem. This use as sacred liturgy would explain its inclusion in a collection of religious texts once the references to other gods had been removed. If the poem had simply originated as a collection of erotic literature, I can't imagine how anyone in Jerusalem could have suggested including it alongside works like Exodus and Isaiah. So I'm inclined to see this text alongside the book of Esther, another story originally involving Ishtar that was later reworked for a monotheistic audience. One final detail of note is that a significant portion of the Song of Songs is written from the woman's point of view. Unlike other books of the Bible where women are passive characters, the woman here takes a leading role in the story and the relationship. She's making plans, arranging encounters, leading her lover to secret destinations, and telling the story. With all of that out of the way, we can finally get started. We're introduced to the Song of Songs with a brief addition to the text claiming that this work comes from Solomon. Immediately following this is a soliloquy from a woman's view, in which she voices her desire to be with her lover. She wishes him to kiss her, as his love is better than wine and sweet perfume. She envisions him as a king who has taken her to his bedchamber. This is part of the language these lovers will use to praise one another, and not meant to be read literally. He isn't actually a king, as she mentions that he works as a shepherd. Also, if he were a king and he had taken the woman into his harem, they could express their affection freely and openly instead of moving about in secret. We then learn a bit about our female poet as she contrasts herself with the chorus of singers. Unlike them, her skin is dark like the tints of Kedar or the curtains of Solomon. Unlike the noble women who live inside all day and have lighter skin, she is darker from her time working in the sun in the family vineyard. She sees her darker complexion as a mark of beauty. The notion of lighter skin being associated with traditional beauty is quite ancient. Wealthier people didn't have to deal with harsh sunlight and could spend more time lounging indoors, so their skin didn't tan as much as the working class. This resulted in common people having darker skin, while the rare nobles had a lighter shade, giving them a somewhat exotic appearance. Wealth often defines beauty, as in bygone centuries in Japan, only the wealthy could afford sweet treats, which would prompt poor oral hygiene and cavities. As only the wealthy could afford bad teeth, a desirable trait became black teeth. Eventually, the practice of ohaguro became popular, as dyes made from iron and sake were invented so that everyone could afford the luxury of beautiful black teeth. Here in Song of Songs, we see that the poet acknowledges the traditional view held by local convention that the lighter skin of nobility is preferred, but her darker skin carries its own beauty. 127 to 27 is the dialogue between lovers. This poem is exactly what the title denotes, two lovers taking turns delivering their lines. Most modern Bibles will inform the reader which lines are delivered by each character. In some, it states woman or man at the beginning of the verse, while others use the W and M abbreviations. If your Bible uses the abbreviations, the chorus will be abbreviated as D for Daughters of Jerusalem. What did you think the D stood for? The poem begins with the woman asking her lover to tell where he grazes his flocks and takes his midday rest. He responds by encouraging her to follow the tracks of his flocks, and she too can pasture her lambs. He then compares his love to a mare that pulls the Pharaoh's chariot. Pro tip: women love being compared to livestock. I'm certain of this. This may seem a bit odd, but the horses which pulled the Pharaoh's chariots would have been adorned with jewels as part of the royal procession. We can assume that the man is complimenting her on her sparkling decorations. He also tells her that her cheeks are lovely in pendants, which likely means that she has dangling earrings, and he promises to give her more jewelry of silver and gold. Something of note here is that the woman doesn't know where her lover goes each day. This leaves us with two possibilities. First, she only sees the man fleetingly when he enters and leaves town. And second, this is an imagined conversation. She's not actually speaking to her lover, but imagining an encounter in which the two young lovers have to sneak off together to the pastures away from prying eyes. The woman then states that her perfume gave forth fragrance while her king lay upon his couch. Of course, she's speaking metaphorically of herself, and the king in question is her shepherd lover who rests between her breasts. He responds by telling her that her eyes are doves. What is meant is that she gives quick, flighty glances. In ancient literature, birds, especially doves, are often messengers, so her glances are delivering the message that her lips cannot. The imagery of a royal setting continues in verse 17, when the woman, expounding upon her lover's handsomeness, begins describing their home as an expansive house with cedar rafters, and describes herself as a lily. Her lover not only agrees with her, but exalts her above other women, claiming she's a lily and the other women are like thorns. She responds in kind, stating that he is an apple tree among the trees of the woods. We get a classic "that's what she said" moment when she tells us she delights to sit in his shadow and taste his sweet fruit. Their love was like a banquet with apples and raisin cakes. She lay in his arms, his left hand beneath her head and his right hand, embraced her, which is a bit redundant as she's already in his embrace, unless this is another euphemism, which of course it is. Here, she's speaking to the other women, the daughters of Jerusalem, expressing her desire to be taken by her lover to a banquet hall where she can enjoy physical contact with him, which is the general message of the entire book, a longing for intimacy and a series of scenarios where that might be achieved. The dialogue ends with the woman saying, "I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and does of the field, do not awaken or stir up love until it is ready." At least, that's how some Bibles render the translation. The difficulty with ancient Hebrew is a lack of vowels or spacing between the words, which results in an endless stream of consonants where the breaks between words must be imagined and numerous meanings are possible. Another possible rendition of this oath could be, "by the God of hosts and God Almighty," which sounds a bit more Jewish, but presents us with a problem. Yahweh is called Lord of Hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, not God of Hosts. This could just be a variant, but it could also mean we're on the wrong track with the translation. Another rendition could be, "by the spirits and goddesses of the field," which makes sense considering the setting for their romantic meetings. And if this oath originated from their polytheistic history, using words that could be rendered as gazelles and does, but also as spirits and goddesses, could be intentional, and the reader was meant to understand both. Of course, we can't be certain which meaning is intended, but the possibilities for all three exist. The third poem completes chapter 2, beginning in verse 8 and ending with verse 17. The poem begins and ends with the woman speaking, and includes a response from her lover in the middle. She begins by announcing the arrival of her lover as he leaps across the hills and mountains like a gazelle. First, she hears him. Then, in verse 9, she sees him, as he is hiding behind the walls of her home and peering through the lattice windows. Once again, she's imagining a clandestine encounter, and upon his arrival, he begins to speak. Or rather, she begins relating his words, as this is likely part of her fantasy. He encourages her to arise and come to him, as the winter rains are over and spring is upon the land. Flowers are in bloom, birds are singing, and grapevines are being pruned. The fig tree gives fruit, and the blossoms offer their fragrance. He then addresses her by saying, "Arise, my friend, my beautiful one, and come, my dove in the cleft of the rocks, in the secret recesses of the cliff. Let me see your face, let me hear your voice." So she's hidden from him, beyond his sight and his reach, and he wants her to come closer. And he wants the sight and sound of her, just as she was treated to the sight and sound of him at the beginning of this poem. The narration then switches back to her point of view as she responds to his request by singing, "Catch for us the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in bloom." The foxes are young suitors who pursue the women, represented by blooming vineyards. This may be part of an ancient courtship ritual in which the young women play a game of hide-and-seek with the men. This might be the origin for the story of the Benjaminites found in Judges 21, where men hide among the fields to abduct girls who went out to dance. If this had originated as part of a pagan ritual, then the story in Judges would serve double duty, disparaging both the courtship ritual and the Benjaminites. She continues by saying she and her lover belong to one another, as her lover roams like a gazelle upon the rugged mountains until the day grows dim and cool, and he returns to her. The fourth poem in the Song of Songs is the woman's address to the daughters of Jerusalem. The brevity of this poem, just the first 5 verses of chapter 3, has led some to believe that it's a fragment of a longer poem, or perhaps the continuation of the poem that ended in chapter 2, verse 7, as this poem shares the same ending, which is repeated verbatim. In this poem, the woman lies in her bed at night, seeking the one whom her soul loves, but she doesn't find him. She wishes in vain that he would join her in bed, but alas, he isn't present. What follows might be interpreted as a dream sequence, as she arises from her bed and ventures into the city through the streets and squares in search for him. But the watchmen find her as they patrol the city streets, so she inquires after her lover, but the guards aren't helpful. Shortly thereafter, she locates him and brings him to her mother's house, into the room where her mother conceived her. The sexual connotation here cannot be denied, as the woman longs to bring her lover to her bed, finds him, and then takes him home with her. She then goes into the room where she herself was conceived. The implication is obvious. We should also note here that, as with much of the Song of Songs, the woman is the active agent. Not only is she telling the story, she seeks out her lover and takes him to her home, bringing him into her house. This is a far cry from the type of literature we've come to expect from Jewish authors in this time period. We aren't sure if she's actually found her lover in this poem, or if this too is part of her fantasy, imagining all of this while lying in bed. At any rate, the poem ends with the familiar oath, "I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and does of the field. Do not awaken or stir up love until it is ready." Our fifth poem is Solomon's Wedding Procession, which finishes out chapter 3, beginning in verse 6 and ending with verse 11. This section of the book is narrated by the chorus, giving the audience a picture of the action. Who is this coming up from the desert, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all kinds of exotic powders? We're then told that we should see the litter of Solomon escorted by 60 valiant men. The issue here is that several of the words used in the description are the feminine forms of the words, meaning that the procession was originally for a woman, not for King Solomon, and the redactor who made the change only modified the occupant of the litter and forgot to change the descriptives associated with the subject. This would indicate that the woman is the central figure of a procession, presumably a wedding procession, in which she is coming to meet her lover, just as the poem in chapter 2, verse 8 depicts the man coming to meet her, and the mention of Solomon is a later addition. The litter is described with royal imagery, just as their home was described earlier. It's made from fine wood from Lebanon, with silver and gold decorations and a seat of purple cloth. The poem ends with an instruction for the daughters of Jerusalem to go out and look upon King Solomon wearing a crown which was given to him by his mother on the day of his marriage. This contradicts the coronation scene in 1 Kings 1 and 1 Chronicles 29, in which the coronation is carried out by Zadok, the priest at the command of David, and possibly with the help of Nathan the prophet in the 1 Kings version. There's no mention of Solomon's mother's involvement in the ordeal, except when she reminds David of his promise to place Solomon on the throne. She doesn't crown him, nor is he married to anyone on that day. So this scene in chapter 3, verse 11, might be a reference to a variant tradition concerning Solomon's coronation, which is no longer preserved in the story of 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles. In the sixth poem, which covers all of chapter 4 and the first verse of chapter 5, the man describes his lover's beauty. It's written almost entirely from the man's point of view, with the exception of chapter 4, verse 16, when the woman speaks briefly, and the end of chapter 5, verse 1, in which the Daughters of Jerusalem chorus came in at the closing of the poem. The guy describes the beauty of his lover using language we're familiar with by this point, comparing her eyes to the flighty doves and her hair tumbling down like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. In the second verse, he states that her teeth are white like a flock of ewes that were recently washed and pregnant with twins. I suppose I could see this as romantic-ish. In a time before modern dentistry, this woman has all of her teeth and they're gleaming white. It's important to note that in some translations, the verse doesn't state that the ewes are pregnant with twins, but that each is accompanied by a twin, meaning that her bottom teeth have their match on top. No missing ewes in the mouth of our lover. Her cheeks are like pomegranate halves. I'm guessing that this means her cheeks are round and flush and not burdened with an overabundance of seeds. Her neck is a tower of David decorated with 1,000 shields. These would be jeweled necklaces. He continues using nature imagery by comparing her breasts to twin gazelle fawns. This is because her breasts are occasionally hunted by cheetahs. I'll be honest, I have no idea how to interpret this one. Just know that the best way to describe a woman's breast is to compare them to young gazelle feeding among lilies. This is a well-known fact. He asks her to descend from Amana, Senir, and Hermon, 3 rugged mountain peaks that symbolize obstacles preventing their union. She ravished his heart with a single glance, and her lips drip honey. She is then compared to an enclosed garden and a sealed fountain. She's lush and fertile, but also sealed away from him. We then switch to her point of view as she calls for the north and south wind to awaken and blow upon her garden to spread its scent to him. We learned from episode 52 that the winds of the 4 canonical directions are good winds, but the winds of the ordinal directions bring dangers and ruin. She then calls for her lover to come into her garden and eat its choicest fruits. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what she means by that. He responds by saying he has come to the garden and eats its honeycomb and drinks wine and milk. The poem concludes with the daughters of Jerusalem calling for the lovers to eat and drink deeply. The ending verses of the poem are a calling for the social constraints that keep the lovers apart to be removed, so they may finally be together. What we may be seeing here is part of a wedding liturgy. The 2 young lovers, not those in the poem but actual people to be married, wish to be together, but social norms prevent this. They yearn for one another's touch but must be kept separate. Their frustration is palpable. Finally, upon the conclusion of the poem, they are to be married, and such restrictions no longer apply. The poem expresses the yearnings of the bride and groom. Chapter 5, verse 2 begins our 7th poem, which concludes in chapter 6, verse 3. In it, the woman addresses the daughters of Jerusalem. Just as we saw in the beginning of chapter 3, the woman lies sleeping in her bed, but her heart is alert. She's dreaming of her lover who is at her door, asking her to open to him. The door in this verse is likely a euphemism, especially in light of the following verses. She has disrobed and washed herself, and her lover then put his hand in through the opening, and her insides trembled because of him. So she opened for her lover. We should also remember that in Jewish literature, they often use other body parts in reference to genitals, so this isn't necessarily his hand that she's imagining inside of the opening. The action seems to switch, as suddenly she's the active individual, though she's imagining her lover is involved, which continues the theme of being an erotic fantasy. It's actually her hands that are doing the work in verse 5. As she says, "My fingers are dripping with myrrh upon the handles of the lock. I opened for my lover, but he was gone." Clearly she isn't speaking of a door. If he was able to reach inside the door and touch her, then he couldn't have been locked outside the room. What we have here is the woman imagining her lover's touch in place of her own, and then waking from her fantasy to discover the disappointment. She then goes in search of him, but is found by the city guards who beat her. Some readers might not understand the implications here, but the city watchmen represent the social conventions which restrict the lovers' actions and prevent them from being together openly. They serve the same role as the rugged peaks that separate the lovers when their relationship is symbolized with nature imagery. They're an obstacle that the lovers have yet to overcome. She begs for the daughters of Jerusalem to find her lover, to tell him she is sick with love. The female chorus asks for a description from this most beautiful woman so they might identify her lover should they come across him. She responds that he is radiant and outstanding among thousands of men, with a golden complexion and thick raven hair. He too gives her fleeting glances as she describes his eyes like doves, and his cheeks are like beds of spices with aromatic scents. She goes on to describe him, literally singing his praises. He's strong and proud and imposing, compared to thick rods of gold, an ivory carving, alabaster pillars, and towering cedars. But he's also sweet and delightful, with lips like lilies, and he speaks kind words to her. This is how she sees her lover, an example of perfection in her eyes. The daughters of Jerusalem ask where her lover has gone so they may help in the search for him, and she responds by stating that he was never actually gone, as he has now gone down to his garden, which is to say that he is with her. Her part ends by stating that she belongs to her lover and he belongs to her, and he feeds among the lilies. Earlier, we're told that he feeds in her garden and gathers lilies. The imagery seems to recall a shepherd with his flock, and also the erotic play between these two young lovers. Our eighth poem begins in chapter 6, verse 4, and completes the chapter. In it, the man describes the beauty of his lover, beginning with comparing her to Tirzah, a Sumerian city in the northern kingdom, fair as Jerusalem, and fearsome as celestial visions. He asks her to look away because her gaze overwhelms him. Again, her hair is compared to a flock of goats streaming down from Gilead, her teeth white as freshly washed ewes, and her cheeks like pomegranate halves behind her veil. The wording here is identical to the opening lines of chapter 4. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines, and young women beyond counting, but she is above all of them. So perfect, she's praised by those other women. They cry out, "Who is this that comes forth like the dawn, beautiful as the white moon, pure as the blazing sun, fearsome as a celestial vision?" Wait a second. Stop the train. What is this? We've been reading a collection of liturgical erotic poems that have nothing at all to do with Yahweh, though it was important enough to Second Temple Jews to be included in their scriptures, and suddenly we're greeted with a phrase that compares a woman with the rising sun and the moon. We know from Jewish writings that worship of other gods and goddesses, even inside the Jerusalem temple, did occur. We've already mentioned the cults of Ishtar and Tammuz earlier in this episode, and Ezekiel 8:14 specifically mentions the women of Jerusalem worshiping Tammuz inside Yahweh's temple. There, they wept for his death and prayed for his return, just as Catholics today do the same for Jesus every year in their Good Friday Passion plays. There, the weeping women played the role of Ishtar who wept for her lover. Here, we find a reference to a woman being equated to the rising sun and compared to the moon. Those of you who listen to episodes 35 to 39 will already know exactly where I'm going with this. There's evidence the Israelites worshipped a female deity, often associated with both Jerusalem and the sun, well into the 1st century CE. Figurines of this goddess have been discovered in droves. Graffiti mentioning pilgrimages to the city to honor her attests to her devotees, and she may very well be the basis for the Holy Spirit, who was originally imagined to be female, and the mysterious woman of Revelation 12, who, like the woman behind this poem, is linked with the sun and moon. Let's take a quick look at Song of Songs 6, verse 10. "Who is this that comes forth like the dawn, beautiful as the white moon, pure as the blazing sun, fearsome as celestial visions?" Now let's read Revelation 12:1, which is a celestial vision. "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Or Malachi 4:2, which describes the rising sun. "But for you who hears my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in her wings." This may be the figure behind the original poetry, and over time she was gradually erased and replaced with the character of a mortal woman. The story of divine marriage between two gods, which would signify the fertility and prosperity of the nation, would eventually become the liturgy of weddings between two people, as the Jews drifted away from polytheism. I can't imagine how a collection of erotic poetry could be included in a collection of scripture unless it had once served a religious purpose, and Yahweh certainly didn't play a part in this. But if any other god had been included, they would need to be expunged before the text could be considered for inclusion in Jewish scripture. Thus, only the faintest hints of the original subject could be expected to remain. And here, in chapter 6, verse 10, we find a dawn goddess that is elsewhere attested in Jewish scripture. Of course, this is far from conclusive, but it is quite suggestive. This poem, and chapter 6, concludes with the woman going down to a walnut grove to see the blossoming vines. There, she became the blessed one of the prince's people. This phrase is a bit troublesome for translators and could also be rendered, I did not know. My soul disturbed me because of the chariots of Aminadab. But what's interesting here isn't the chariots or the blessed ones or the princes of Aminadab. It's the walnut grove. I won't get into it now, but keep it in mind because we, like the woman, will return to that grove shortly. Chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8 contains our 9th poem and concerns the woman's beauty. It begins with the daughters of Jerusalem asking the woman to turn around so they might gaze upon her. She responds by asking how they can gaze upon her as if she were performing the dance of the two camps. The exact meaning isn't made clear, but it's possible this refers to a celebration when two tribes met in the wilderness and joined for feasting. Or perhaps the two camps refers to the two families at a marriage celebration. Either way, they're expecting her to perform a dance for them so they may enjoy her beauty. The man chimes in, describing the beauty of her feet, her curving thighs, and the round bowl of her valley. This is probably meant to be understood as her navel, but it's a thinly veiled allusion to another body part, especially as he goes on to describe it as having a mound of wheat. Either he's referring to a spot lower down her anatomy, or his bride has a lush nest of belly hair. He then compares her breasts to fawns and her eyes like deep pools. She has a prominent nose, described as a tower, and thick locks of hair. In verse 8, he tells us that her breasts are like clusters of date palms, and in the following verse, he proclaims his intention to climb atop her and take hold of those date palms. He's forgetting to be circumspect by this section of the book, but who can really blame him? She chimes in verse 10, telling him his mouth is like sweet wine that flows smoothly over her lips, and repeats her proclamation that she belongs to her lover. Again, she wishes to go with him to the vineyards to see if the flowers are in bloom, where she will give him her love and her choicest fruits. She then laments that, if only they were siblings, they could be together in public without penalty. And then she could lead him to her mother's house, where she would let him drink her pomegranate juice. Again, his left hand is beneath her head, and his right hand embraces her, and she tells the daughters of Jerusalem not to stir up love until it is ready. Now let's take a look at her comments about them being siblings. On the surface, it may seem a bit gross, but this is not an incest thing. She's talking about society preventing them from being together. She's not allowed to walk with her lover unescorted in public as she would like. Now, she could take a stroll with her brother and no one would care. But she longs to walk with her lover. This disagreement with societal conventions runs throughout the book and is integral to the message. The two lovers desire one another but can't be together, yet they long for a time when their contact will be unrestricted. Our book ends with chapter 8. Just as we're treated to an approaching litter from the desert in the beginning of the Song of Songs, a similar scene appears at the end. Beginning in verse 5, we have our 10th poem. The daughters of Jerusalem ask, "Who is this coming up from the desert, leaning upon her lover?" The woman chimes in, speaking to her lover. "Beneath the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother conceived you." As before, when she wished to take her lover into her home, to the room where she had been conceived, now she has taken her lover to the place where his mother had conceived him. They're always attempting to go to groves and to closed rooms, and if the purpose wasn't clear by now, I'm not sure it ever will be. Their love is as strong as death, their longing as fierce as shield. This hints at the myth of Ishtar's love for Tammuz, their love strong enough to conquer death and rescue him from the underworld. We're treated to a bit of Genesis cosmogony here, as she states that the deep waters can't quench their love. This is the primordial waters of the world before the creation, the great sea dragon which must be defeated to bring order out of chaos. And I should note here that the sun goddess of Revelation 12 is said to face off against that dragon later in that same chapter. The woman then quotes her brothers as they once boasted about protecting her in her youth. She was their little sister, not yet a grown woman, a young girl who didn't yet have breasts. They built a wall around her, a sealed door to protect her. She speaks up again, stating that her breasts are now like towers, meaning she is now grown and no longer needs their protection. She's stepping away from them as she is no longer a child. The next few verses are troublesome as the speaker isn't clear. If the man is speaking, it would indicate he has possession of her. If the woman is the speaker, then the verses indicate she's boasting of her great value. To me, the latter makes more sense, as the former simply doesn't fit with the rest of the book, but we'll consider both options and explain why both meanings could be correct. This section begins with the statements that Solomon had a vineyard at Baal-Hamon, which he put in possession of caretakers. Its fruit was worth 1,000 silver pieces. The text shifts to the first person as it states, "My vineyard is at my own disposal. The 1,000 silver pieces are for you, Solomon, and 200 for the caretakers." We've already seen earlier in the episode that the woman was a caretaker of her own vineyard, and also likened to a vineyard herself, as well as a garden. So these verses that label her one of Solomon's vineyards could indicate her great value. This would be supported by verse 12, where she states her vineyard is at her own disposal. But let's suppose a different meaning. She is a great treasure under the care of her father and brothers, and now her husband is purchasing her. The first reading obviously fits better with the story, though the second meaning could be correct, as it could be an addition to the book written in by someone who held that particular view. Either way, verses 11 and 12 don't quite fit and seem to interrupt the text. If those two verses are skipped and one reads from verse 10 straight to verse 13, the text flows a bit better. In verse 13, the man addresses his lover as, "You who dwell in the gardens," which sounds a bit Lovecraftian, but is probably similar to calling her a dove hiding in the rocks, as in chapter 2, verse 14, especially since there's a near repeat of chapter 2, verse 17 shortly thereafter. He asks to hear her voice, to which she replies, "Swiftly, my lover, be like a gazelle or a young stag upon the mountains of spices." This is to match the earlier description of him as a gazelle or a young stag upon the rugged mountains, coming to her at the day's end. So what are we to make of this text? Apologists claim layers of allegory within the Song of Songs, which speak of Yahweh's connection with Israel. The love here expressed represents his covenant with the chosen people of Abraham. Others retroject Jesus into the narrative, claiming this is a love letter from the Christ to his church. Both of these suffer various fatal flaws, such as the bulk of the tale coming from the woman's point of view, meaning this would be a love letter from the nation or the church to Yahweh, or to Jesus, and not the other way around, or the clearly sexual nature of their love. Another is the complete lack of submissive roles, which both the Old Testament Yahweh and the New Testament Jesus demand, as the nation and the church respectively must obey their divine leaders. Here in the Song of Songs, the man and the woman are presented as equals in their relationship, with the woman often taking charge and leading the man to where she wishes him to go. And of course, there's the complete lack of threats, which define the relationship between Yahweh and his people, from his first words to the denizens of Eden, where he threatened to kill them if they ate from a tree, to the curse of Leviticus 26:29, where Yahweh threatens to force the Israelites to eat their own children. How can this collection of poems about two young people who adore one another ever be conflated with such a dysfunctional relationship? Simply put, it can't. Those claiming the Song of Songs is allegorical for the relationship between Yahweh or Jesus and some human institution are simply giving voice to wishful thinking. They desperately want this book to not be a collection of erotic poetry, but that's exactly what it is. Yet, it's so much more than that. For the first and only time in the entirety of the Bible, a woman is truly given voice. She's her lover's equal. She has a say in their relationship, in where they go and what they do. She's allowed to explore her own sexuality. Rather than live as someone's property, she exists as her own person. Or as she puts it, my vineyard is at my own disposal. This is a tale of two lovers, two excited people in a relationship who are infatuated with one another, who long to be with one another, not for the purpose of continuing the family tradition, for providing heirs for their property, for unifying tribes, or to complete a marriage which was arranged for them. They seek each other out because they wish to be together. And when they aren't, they fantasize about a time when they will be. Moreover, they wish for a better world, one which would allow them to be together as they should be, rather than waiting for their marriage. And that's what this book is. A collection of love poetry that was probably used to symbolize the yearnings of youthful couples prior to their weddings, prior to the time when the gates to their gardens would finally be open to them. But it might also be more than that. Remember that walnut grove from chapter 6, verse 11? The one that followed closely the mention of the sun and moon deities? In Wyatt's religious text from Ugarit, page 336, we find a copy of the wedding of Nichol and Yahweh. We aren't sure of Nichol's role within the pantheon, but her husband Yahweh is the moon god, and she gives birth to a sun god. In the poem, Nichol, daughter of Harab, the king of weddings, is embraced by her lover Yahweh at nightfall and became pregnant. A dowry of 1,000 pieces of silver is paid, and her fertility is equated to orchards and vineyards. Yahweh's beauty is mentioned in the song as the brightness of the moon, and the two go down to a walnut grove for the wedding ceremony. All the while, the singers are calling to the Katharat, the daughters of Elil, who will help the lovers to conceive. She even longs for her lover to enter her with a similar physical description of her excitement. Now, I'm not claiming this erotic poem is the original basis for the Song of Songs. Not at all. I only point to it as an example of the type of poetry that existed in the region at the time, concerning the erotic stories of solar and lunar deities. This particular poem includes the daughters, physical descriptions of their lovemaking, the mentions of him embracing her, the exact value of 1,000 pieces of silver for a dowry, the celestial visions, and going down to a walnut grove. While this may not be the actual origin of the Song of Songs, they're certainly in the same genre. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.